All right. We're going to go to Eliana Ros-Lehtinen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we must counter China's expansion and increasing aggression whenever and wherever possible. And we must have freedom of navigation, free flow of commerce by pushing back against China's territorial claims and its man-made islands in the South China Sea. However, as we negotiate trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, we must not lose sight of the values that we are trying to protect, like human rights, as we achieve trade pacts with responsible nations. And that's why I oppose TPP, because of the inclusion of Vietnam in the deal. The people of Vietnam are living under a brutal communist regime which is imprisoning thousands of political dissidents, prisoners of conscience, and ethnic and religious minorities. In Vietnam, violence and discrimination against women and minorities are common, and the judicial system is corrupt. Violations of religious freedom are so prevalent that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is recommending that Vietnam be added to the State Department's list of countries of particular concern, something the Commission has done since 2001. In Vietnam, there is no rule of law, there is no freedom of the press, there is no freedom of speech, there is no freedom of assembly, and access to the internet and information are all severely restricted. Child labor and forced labor continue in conditions that are already poor, and sex and human trafficking remain horrendously rampant. And this is a country we want to call a trade partner? In addition to the human rights abuses, there are reports that TPP would allow Vietnam and China, using Vietnam as an access point, to do serious harm to the textile industry in nations in Central America, with which we already have free trade agreements. There are estimates that Vietnam and China's subsidized textiles would put hundreds of thousands of people in Central American nations and the Dominican Republic out of work, right when we are dealing with enormous social and security problems in our own region. According to some of the CAFTA DR countries, if Vietnam gets its way, the combination of its own massive state-owned textile and apparel countries and subsidized inputs from China may come in duty-free into the United States. This could wipe out most of the textile and apparel industry in our Western Hemisphere. I'm concerned that the loss of this sector to China would result in mass unemployment, increased social problems, and mass migration. Free trade agreements, especially with worthwhile partners in Asia, are needed in order to secure U.S. economic interests and to strengthen our alliance to counter Chinese aggression. But they must not come at the expense of human rights, and they must take into account the interests and the obligations we have with our free trade partners, especially in our own hemisphere. So following up on the points that Congressman Smith and Ranking Member Engel made, I was disappointed that neither of you mentioned human rights a single time in your written testimony. How important are human rights to the administration's trade agenda? What have you communicated to the Vietnamese regime about its human rights practices? What repercussions will the regime suffer under TPP if it continues to violate the human rights of its people? You testified that TPP has enforcement mechanisms for violation of labor standards. What are they, and what about other human rights? What mechanisms are in place to flag those violations? And lastly, will TPP allow state-subsidized Vietnamese and Chinese textiles to enter the market, and what impact would this have on a textile industry in CAFTA countries?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Ros-Lehtinen. I'll begin and then turn to Charlie Rifkin on rules of origin and textiles, if I may. First and foremost, human rights is central to our foreign policy and central to our Vietnam policy. It's a key
But
element.
it's not in your testimony?
Well, my testimony addresses U.S. values, and the values component includes rule of law, includes transparency, includes good governance, includes labor standards, includes anti-trafficking, and that is what we are working on with Vietnam. That's what we seek to advance through TPP. When the president of Vietnam was in Washington, President Obama and I was there, the two leaders agreed in a joint statement that protecting and promoting human rights will be a key element of the U.S.-Vietnam comprehensive partnership, and
Excuse me,
it
sir,
is.
but you realize that when you come and you testify and we have the written testimony and your oral testimony and it's not mentioned, I think that telegraphs a very strong message to the folks overseas. They hear what we don't say as well.
Congresswoman, I am, and certainly Secretary Kerry and President Obama are abundantly on record. There should be no doubt that human rights is central to our foreign policy, and in Vietnam in particular, we push for lifting restrictions on freedom of expression. We advocate for the release of prisoners of conscience, and we push for all Vietnamese to be able to express their opinions. I believe that TPP does not come at the expense of human rights. TPP is a driver for human rights in
And what
Vietnam.
about the enforcement mechanisms? You say we have that for labor standards. What about other human rights? What are the mechanisms that we have for enforcement?
If I may, before I get to enforcement, let me tell you, may I share one episode? There is currently a Facebook campaign underway in Vietnam called I Hate the Communist Party Because. And it shows individual citizens, Vietnamese citizens, standing up and holding placards that are posted in Vietnam on Facebook with their objections to the Communist Party's policies. This has been going on for months. The government accepts it. It is a direct function of the government's determination to do what it has to in order to join TPP. That is enforcement mechanism number one. Beyond that, within the agreement...
So let me get
Well,
this straight.
wait,
That's okay.
wait.
Thank you, Mr.
Could we just hear the witness finish, because we're out of time, and then we'll go to the next question.
The binding enforcement elements of the trade agreement are similarly binding on the provisions regarding labor rights, standards, government transparency, and they create opportunities for either dispute resolution under the TPP mechanisms, or even for sanctions and the suspension of the benefits that accrue to Vietnam as a trading partner under TPP.
Okay.